Often those who seem distant and unapproachable are simply erecting barriers to avoid repeated emotional wounds. The pain experienced leaves an indelible mark on the personality, changing the perception of the world, and, unfortunately, this often goes unnoticed by others. As Carl Jung said, unspoken pain goes deep, transforming into certain behavioral patterns. We will further examine how past trials shape a person's behavior and why they act the way they do. Most importantly, we will explore ways to transform this hidden pain into conscious acceptance of the present. This will allow us to look at ourselves with more leniency and at others with deep understanding. People seem cold not because they are, but because they are trying to protect themselves. Some are difficult to love, not because of their character, but because of their acquired distrust of this feeling. Behavior that others perceive as alienation, rigidity, or complexity is actually a defensive reaction of the psyche to past pain. Pain that has not found an outlet turns into armor, which over time can become part of the personality, although it is just a mask woven from silence stitch by stitch by the thread of emotional survival. Carl Jung, an outstanding Swiss psychiatrist and founder of analytical psychology, once remarked that pain is a kind of currency that the soul uses to pay for the expansion of consciousness. Jung by no means glorified suffering, but he considered it an integral part of the process of spiritual growth and transformation. Strong emotional pain, if listened to with due attention and respect, is able to point not only to the source of our wounds, but also to those aspects of our lives that we have forgotten or neglected. In other words, deep suffering has a formative effect on our behavior, which is not always due to innate temperament. Often, such behavior is a desperate attempt by the ego to keep the soul alive, even when it is buried under the rubble of life's adversities. People who have had to endure a lot of suffering develop complex psychological mechanisms that often go unnoticed, even by themselves. Their reactions, ways of building relationships, strategies of defense or retreat. All this is not accidental. This is a complex structure, erected from deep, unconscious layers of the psyche, designed to prevent the re-experiencing of the original pain. To condemn such behavior is like looking at a scar and ignoring the deep wound that preceded it. However, there is another approach, a look that does not ask the question, "What's wrong with you?" but asks, "What happened to you?" It is this perspective that can transform suffering into deep understanding. It views behavior as a kind of clue, code, map, as the psyche communicates with us through symbols, repetitions, and emotional patterns. And every reaction that seems exaggerated or inadequate may be an echo of old pain, calling for recognition and healing. In the depths of a suffering soul, there is no room for empty pity. Its true desire is to be seen and understood. Empathetic attention becomes the first ray of light, capable of calming the automatic reactions of the ego and opening it to perception. Realizing that pain is a formative but not a defining factor allows us to gradually free ourselves from the protective armor that was mistakenly taken for a part of ourselves. In place of the former rigidity, a space arises, still vulnerable but genuine, where consciousness begins to come into contact with what it previously only fenced itself off from. Some emotional wounds do not disappear without a trace, they transform, growing deep into the personality. If these wounds remain unrecognized and unworked through, they turn into living foci, continuing to react even after the danger has passed. Carl Jung called these formations complexes, unconscious emotional structures with their own psychic life. By themselves they are not negative, they are defense mechanisms created by the soul to overcome the shocks that the ego could not cope with alone. As an example, consider a person who has experienced deep rejection in childhood. Moreover, this is not always expressed in explicit forms. Sometimes a cold silence, an absent look speaking more than any words, is enough. This unintegrated emotional shock forms a rejection complex. Years later, such a person may react sharply to any situation reminiscent of alienation, a restrained answer, a delay in responding to a message, a neutral facial expression of the interlocutor. It's not about exaggeration, it's about activating the complex. The old wound reasserts itself with the same force as at the moment it was inflicted. Carl Jung once remarked that everyone has complexes, but the real problem arises when these complexes begin to control a person. At the moment of activation, the complex seems to seize consciousness, plunging the individual into a maelstrom of emotions, often inexplicable and incomprehensible to them. A person may suddenly burst into tears for no apparent reason, flare up with disproportionate anger, withdraw into themselves, or experience a crushing emptiness due to a minor event. Such behavior, seemingly irrational at first glance, actually has its own logic in the emotional structure of those who have experienced a lot of pain. Often, people who have gone through difficult trials spend years thinking about themselves in a negative light, considering themselves too complicated, too sensitive, or too emotional. However, the truth is that these complexes act as a kind of alarm signal that goes off when the subconscious mind detects a similarity between the current situation and a traumatic experience from the past. Even if the conscious mind does not immediately realize this connection, these emotional cores do not disappear with a wave of a magic wand. They are transformed only when they are recognized and accepted. This process begins with an internal dialogue, with the ability to listen to oneself. What exactly needs attention and care right now? Where does this reaction come from? What is this pain trying to protect? The conscious mind is not able to eradicate the complex, but it is able to deprive it of the power that allowed it to dominate imperceptibly. Complexes are not flaws, but rather emotional imprints of the past. And when a person learns to listen to them without fear or judgment, they will stop shouting and start whispering. In this whisper lies the possibility for the soul to rebuild, not to erase the past, but to create an internal space where pain will stop reacting spontaneously and can finally be surrounded by care and understanding. Distrust is not just a lack of warmth in relationships, but rather an instinct for self-preservation developed through experience. For a person whose feelings have been deeply hurt, where they expected the most protection and understanding, returning to trusting relationships becomes a difficult task. This is associated with a risk that the conscious mind, striving to protect itself from repeated pain, tries to avoid. Even in an environment of apparent safety, the inner world of such a person remains on guard, because the subconscious mind does not distinguish between current events and past traumas. It reacts to familiar emotional signals, triggering defensive mechanisms. This constant vigilance is a kind of adaptation to a world that once ceased to seem reliable. The reason for this may be the betrayal of a loved one, the unexpected termination of an emotional connection, or the lack of support in a difficult moment. It is important to understand that it is not so much the scale of what happened that matters, but its impact on the psyche. Once rooted, distrust forces the conscious mind to erect invisible barriers, causing the person to be suspicious of others. They begin to interpret glances, analyze silences, and anticipate possible disappointments in advance. And even when there are no real signs of danger, the imagination paints threatening scenarios just to prevent a repeated blow from under the covers. A person burdened by past experience finds themselves in a paradoxical situation. Current existence does not bring satisfaction, but fear of repeating the pain experienced paralyzes the will to change. Distrust becomes their constant companion, penetrating into the very essence of the perception of the surrounding world. Every word, gesture, and even expression of tenderness from another person is subjected to careful analysis and doubt. Subconsciously, barriers are built because faith in sincerity seems more risky than refusing to get close. As Carl Jung noted, such a protective reaction of the psyche is due to the desire for self-preservation and not malice. The ego, taught by bitter experience, perceives trust as an unaffordable luxury for which you have to pay dearly. However, such protection has its price, the impossibility of establishing genuine intimacy. A person who is constantly waiting for a blow is not able to open up and establish a deep emotional connection. The healing process begins with the realization that reactions are dictated not by the current situation, but by echoes of the past. It is important to understand that fear is rooted not in the present, but in the emotional echo that continues to pulsate inside. It takes a lot of courage to momentarily silence the inner anxiety and ask yourself, is the threat real, or is it just a memory that distorts the perception of reality? Trust does not imply the immediate destruction of all erected walls. It is rather a gradual permission to oneself for small experiments with emotional reality. It is the realization that the present may differ from the past, and that a new person should not be held responsible for the mistakes made by others. Distrust is not a mistake, but a natural reaction to the pain experienced. However, once the ego realizes the danger has passed, it may gradually lower its guard and allow itself to relax. In everyone's life, there are times when the world around seems fragile and unreliable. Faith in people and circumstances is undermined, close relationships become a source of danger, and suffering becomes a constant companion. In such moments, loneliness becomes not just a conscious decision, but a natural protective reaction. Just as the body recoils from a painful touch, a wounded soul seeks solitude, not out of a desire to manipulate others or out of pride, but because of a feeling of extreme vulnerability. Any expression of emotions seems too risky, so the person erects invisible barriers around themselves and retreats into silence. Such a flight into oneself often causes misunderstanding. Observers see only coldness, detachment, and indifference. However, those who experience this state from within realize that isolation is a kind of psychological refuge where the soul tries to restore its integrity after a trauma. It is in this darkness, away from the outside world, that a person tries to remember who they really are. In a situation where the world has lost its safety, immersion in oneself can be seen as part of a symbolic process of dying and rebirth, as Carl Jung envisioned. The soul goes into the shadows not because of a rejection of life, but because of the need to protect itself until it regains the ability to breathe freely again. And sometimes silence becomes the only available way of expression for someone who is just learning to recognize and name their pain. However, it should be remembered that a place intended as a safe haven risks turning into a real prison over time. A temporary respite, designed to restore strength, imperceptibly forms a stable pattern of behavior that is difficult to get rid of. A means of protection, designed to protect against external threats, paradoxically leads to prolonged isolation, alienating a person from the world and those around them. And then the safe harbor begins to suffocate, depriving freedom and joy of life. The mind adapts to the idea that there is no one to count on, and the belief is formed that help is nowhere to be found. The heart, although it continues to beat, languishes in captivity behind a locked door, the key to which seems to be lost forever. But consciousness is able to change this sad picture. There is no room for haste in this transformation. The main thing is sincerity and honesty with oneself. It is necessary to admit, yes, I have isolated myself from the world in order to survive, but perhaps now I no longer need to remain in solitude constantly. Inner awareness begins to gradually weaken the armor erected for self-protection. Isolation gradually transforms into solitude, a state when being alone with oneself does not mean detachment from the whole world. It is at this moment that the long-awaited meeting becomes possible. A meeting with one's own feelings with another person, with life itself. A meeting that takes place not by coercion, but by the call of the heart. Someone who has truly experienced a retreat into themselves gains the ability to recognize with greater clarity the moment when it is safe to open the door to the world, even if only a little, taking step by step towards a new life. There are personalities who radiate unwavering confidence and determination, as if they possess infallible knowledge about their life path. However, behind this mask of self-control often hides deep emotional pain. This is the pain of those who learned at an early age that the expression of feelings does not find a response in the world around them. Psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott deeply understood this psychological dynamic. He observed how children deprived of the necessary care and support form a false self, a protective mechanism designed to hide their true essence. This happens not of their own free will, but out of harsh necessity. When their cries go unheard, they learn a cruel lesson. Be silent, do not express your feelings. Over the years, this dynamic transforms into what Carl Jung called the persona, the social mask that we all wear to one degree or another. However, for people who have experienced deep emotional wounds, this mask can turn into a real golden cage. What initially served as a means of adaptation eventually becomes an integral part of their identity. The control that once protected them from the outside world now limits their freedom. In their minds, a painful question begins to sound. Who would I be if I could just be myself without this mask? The persona itself is not a problem. It is present in every person and plays an important role in facilitating social interactions, protecting privacy, and ensuring a certain level of adaptation to society. The problem arises when we begin to identify too strongly with this mask, when it ceases to be a tool and becomes our second skin. This is often the case with those who have experienced too much suffering in their lives. People who have known the bitterness of rejection, humiliation, or betrayal often feel too vulnerable to openly display their fragility. As a result, they develop the ability to skillfully feign strength, create the appearance of being completely in control, and behave as if nothing can affect them. However, this carefully constructed image is far from the truth, representing only a protective barrier. Often this shield is elegant, well thought out, and functional, but at the same time it bears the mark of loneliness, because the more impenetrable the external mask becomes, the more hidden the soul languishing behind it. That is why sometimes people who have experienced emotional wounds give the impression of being cold, detached, and even arrogant. But this is only an appearance. In reality, they are overly protective of themselves, not allowing themselves to weaken their defenses. Their ego has learned a painful lesson. Expressing emotions can have dire consequences, and excessive openness is fraught with danger. As a result, it erects invisible barriers, memorizes prepared phrases, tries on neutral smiles, and gives automatic answers. All this is done for one purpose only: to keep the pain locked up, out of reach of others. But even the most durable mask is not absolutely invulnerable. Sooner or later, cracks appear in it, arising at the moment when the soul can no longer bear the imprisonment, when the burden of loneliness becomes unbearable, and the inner silence is deafening in its intrusiveness, drowning out any external proprieties. And then a turning point occurs. The question, how do I look in the eyes of others, gives way to another, deeper one. Who am I really? It is from this moment that the healing process begins. It does not consist in completely abandoning the protective mask, but in gradually weakening the need to hide behind it. For true strength lies not in appearing imperturbable, but in allowing oneself to be seen in all one's vulnerability, even when fear has not yet completely subsided. Empathy, this complex feeling, does not always grow from the depths of conscious understanding. Sometimes its roots go into the depths of personal, unresolved emotional pain. People who have gone through the crucible of suffering often acquire heightened sensitivity to the misfortune of others. They are like antennas, catching the slightest nuances of other people's experiences, anticipating the storm of emotions. Their hearts easily respond to the pain of others. At first glance, this ability seems like a gift, and to a certain extent, it is. However, when empathy crosses the boundaries of reason and turns into an escape from oneself, it turns from an act of sympathy into a painful projection. Often, the one who is too zealous in sympathizing with others actually feels the need for sympathy for himself, but does not realize it. The pain of others becomes a mirror reflecting his own, not yet healed wounds. And instead of delving into the study of his own mental torment, a person tries to heal the pain of others, as if healing his own bleeding wound with someone else's bandage. This process is subtle and almost imperceptible, but it does take place. Such a person dissolves in others, sacrifices himself, and is always ready to lend a shoulder. Over time, this selflessness becomes his calling card, his identity. He seems to be saying, I am the one who understands, I am the one who endures, I am the one who supports others. But behind this mask of altruism often lies an unconscious desire to avoid meeting oneself with one's own unresolved problems. Caring for others seems like a safer path than plunging into the abyss of one's own experiences. In this context, Jung's teaching on the mechanisms of projection is particularly relevant. When a person is unable to cope with an internal conflict, he projects it outward. In the case of excessive empathy, part of one's own pain is projected onto another person. This creates an illusion of closeness, but at the same time it is exhausting, since any relationship built on imbalance is doomed to failure. Limitless empathy often becomes a harbinger of emotional exhaustion when a person, as if exhausted his resources, is in a state of constant fatigue. He feels the experiences of others with excessive intensity, and often without realizing it, enters into relationships where he plays the role of a selfless donor, while the partner is content with the role of a consumer. Such a model of behavior has nothing to do with true love, representing rather a form of emotional codependency disguised as heightened sensitivity. The healing process begins with a subtle but significant shift in consciousness, the realization that empathy for another should not occur at the expense of one's own needs. The ability to hear another's pain only becomes genuine when a person has learned to listen to their own experiences. Providing help should not be reduced to taking on someone else's burden, but rather involves moving forward together with respect for each other's personal boundaries. True empathy grows out of an internal recognition of one's own pain, transforming into a steady, calm presence, free from exaggeration and the desire to rescue. It simply becomes available. A person who has learned to take care of themselves is able to give themselves fully to another without losing their own identity. It is this kind of empathy that has healing power, quiet, modest, and deeply human. For a person who has known the bitterness of emotional wounds, love becomes an act that requires considerable effort. It's not about a lack of desire for intimacy, but rather that the mind is filled with memories of past suffering. Every new beginning is overshadowed by the burden of past failures. And even if the new partner seems completely different, deep down there remains a wariness. Feelings arise, but their expression is hindered by internal defenses, and connections are made cautiously. This is love clad in armor. Such emotional restraint is often mistakenly perceived as coldness and insensitivity. However, it is not an absence of emotions, but rather the result of a psyche that has learned to protect what once caused unbearable pain. The fear is not directed at a specific person, but at the feelings they may awaken. Painful memories of loneliness, renewed disappointment, shattered trust. That is why the heart approaches with caution, and the mind, like a weary warrior, is in no hurry to lay down its arms. Carl Jung noted that complexes manifest with particular force in relationships, and in moments of intimacy, old, unhealed wounds make themselves known again. People who have gone through difficult trials often love only with a part of themselves, maintaining distance, always having a fallback plan. This position, which seems protective, actually undermines the very possibility of establishing a real connection. After all, in order to truly connect, it is necessary to allow oneself to be vulnerable, to learn to distinguish reality from the echoes of the past. The current partner is not the person who once caused emotional pain, but the old wound persistently forces one to see the world through the prism of past experience. Carl Jung wisely noted, "True love is born where projections end. As long as we transfer our fears, weaknesses, and past traumas to another person, we cannot see their true essence." As a result, relationships risk turning into an arena of struggle between the ghosts of the past and hopes for the future. Love, which is meant to give freedom and inspiration, is constrained by tension and mistrust. The healing process in this delicate area requires time and patience. It requires full presence in the moment, attentive attention to the partner, and deep internal honesty with oneself. It is important to ask yourself the key question: am I really reacting to what is happening now, or is the pain of past days speaking in me? Trust is not a reckless leap into the abyss, but a gradual realization that there are safe havens where love does not cause suffering. It is an understanding that you can love without dissolving into another person, and trust without losing your own identity. And when this awareness comes, the need for protective armor disappears by itself. Without any violence to oneself, it simply becomes unnecessary. There are people who radiate calm and confidence, never seeking support or showing vulnerability. Others perceive them as a model of resilience, capable of overcoming any difficulties. However, often this apparent steadfastness is not the result of a conscious choice, but a consequence of life circumstances. In situations where there was nowhere to expect help, their soul was forced to independently seek support and move forward. The power of those who have gone through difficult trials has deep roots. It manifests not in loud statements or displays of self-confidence, but in a quiet but unwavering resolve. This strength is born from fatigue, falls, and subsequent rises, from constant fear of collapse and the need to move forward no matter what. It is a quiet but solid structure built from effort, pain, and perseverance. Carl Jung, the renowned Swiss psychiatrist and philosopher, noted that suffering often becomes a catalyst for the search for the self, the deep core of the human psyche. When external circumstances collapse, the inner essence continues to stubbornly hold on. It is this self that supports the soul in moments when the ego is unable to cope with the situation. It quietly whispers, "Keep going," even when there are no visible prospects. It is an inner voice that calls from the darkness, guiding a person towards the light. When inner strength doesn't find an outlet in tenderness and care, it tends to crystallize, turning into armor around the heart. A soul accustomed to a continuous struggle for survival gradually loses its ability to be defenseless and open. This transformation leads to hardening, creating an impenetrable barrier not only to the outside world, but also to oneself. Opening up and showing vulnerability after years of independently overcoming difficulties seems like a betrayal of one's own resilience and principles. True strength lies in the harmonious combination of power and sensitivity. Being strong doesn't mean denying the need for support, but rather knowing how to find comfort and rest in the embrace of a reliable person. It's the ability to admit one's fatigue and weakness without fear of losing balance and falling. It's important to realize that strength can also manifest in softness and compliance. When the soul realizes that there is no longer a need for a continuous struggle, a new, more mature strength is born, the strength of awareness. It allows one to accept one's history with all its scars, without dwelling on the past and without using it as proof of one's resilience. It is at this moment that the life path ceases to be lonely, even if outwardly it seems quiet and secluded. There are individuals whose existence unfolds more in the mental sphere than in physical reality. They are immersed in a constant thought process, meticulously analyzing every movement, recreating past conversations, and developing probable scenarios as if their minds never know peace. At first glance, such activity may be perceived as a manifestation of high intelligence, but often it is a disguised fear. Excessive thinking can serve as a sophisticated way of avoiding feelings. For those who have experienced deep suffering, the emotional sphere can seem like a very unstable and dangerous territory. Feelings associated with intense pain are perceived as a threat, and then the ego finds a peculiar solution. It transfers all experiences to a rational level. The mind becomes a refuge, a zone of control, a place where everything is predictable, explainable, and understandable. However, in this relentless pursuit of control, the spontaneity of emotional expression gradually fades away. The renowned psychologist Carl Jung warned that knowledge alone is not enough to transform a personality. He argued, "To know is not sufficient. One must live, and to live means to feel, even when it causes pain." Excessive reflection is an ego strategy aimed at keeping pain in a suspended state. However, what is not lived through and felt cannot be integrated into the personality, and what is not integrated continues to exert a hidden influence from the shadows. Often people prone to excessive thinking have difficulty identifying and naming their emotions. They are well aware of what is happening, able to explain the situation and recognize certain patterns, but remain paralyzed, unable to move. This is because analysis, not supported by emotional acceptance, becomes a vicious circle that does not lead to the resolution of internal conflicts. The relentless cycle of understanding and blocking is what accompanies a person on their life path. Reason seems to be a reliable stronghold, while feelings are often perceived as something unsafe. This is the underlying logic that many follow, but the paradox is that it is feelings that possess transformative power. Only when pain permeates the entire being, and not just the mind, does the opportunity arise to stop and rethink what is happening. This does not mean plunging into the abyss of suffering, but rather allowing oneself to be honest with what is, without hiding behind contrived arguments. Healing lies not in suppressing thoughts, but in creating a space where thought and emotion can coexist harmoniously, allowing the body to express itself, giving way to tears, and accepting silence without immediately trying to explain it. This is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of humanity. When thought ceases to serve as a defense and becomes a tool for knowledge, it returns to its true role, to clarify, not to defend. And then gradually the soul realizes that feelings are not a threat, but an integral part of life. There is a special sensitivity that cannot be learned. It is born from pain. Many people who have gone through difficult trials acquire a presence filled with warmth and almost intuitive understanding. They know how to listen without judgment, feel what another person cannot express in words, and unerringly identify the source of pain because they themselves have once experienced something similar. They can be called wounded healers, as Jung said, drawing a parallel with the archetype of Chiron, the centaur from Greek mythology who, despite his own wound, had the gift of healing others. The ability to empathize and support others does not always stem from a state of inner harmony and mental health. Often it arises from a subconscious desire to heal in another person the wounds that are bleeding within ourselves. This impulse is undoubtedly beautiful, but it also harbors danger, as it can lead to complete oblivion of one's own needs and requirements. Caring for the well-being of another becomes a primary task, pushing personal pain and suffering into the background. In this case, suffering serves as a kind of bridge connecting with another person, but it does not become a path leading to self-knowledge and healing. The wounded healer archetype has a dual nature. It encompasses both tremendous strength and a certain fragility. The strength manifests in the ability to transform personal pain into sincere compassion and empathy for others. The fragility lies in the tendency to hide behind the mask of a caregiver, as if by offering support and attention to others, one tries to avoid a painful encounter with one's own shortcomings and vulnerability. That is why those who tirelessly care for everyone around them often experience a deep sense of loneliness and isolation. Carl Jung, an outstanding Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, deeply understood this psychological trap. He noted that the human psyche constantly strives for balance, and excessive care for others, directed outward, may be just a reflection of neglecting one's own inner world. When an act of consolation and support is accompanied by a feeling of exhaustion, quiet irritation, or a sense of one's own invisibility and insignificance, this is a clear sign that the wounded healer archetype is in a state of imbalance and requires close attention. In this context, recovery implies not evading participation and empathy, but rather accepting this care as part of one's own existence. It is the realization that another's pain can resonate within you, but should not completely take over your being. It is important that attention to the external world and the needs of others is combined with deep self-analysis and understanding of one's own feelings. A person can provide support without taking on the unbearable burden of other people's problems. Turning a mental trauma into a source of wisdom and awareness is what makes a person who has gone through suffering a healing force for themselves and others. When this inner transformation occurs, caring for others ceases to be a way to escape from one's own problems and becomes a conscious and voluntary choice. The driving force is not the desire to save someone, but the ability to cope with one's own pain, which allows one to respect the suffering of others. Subdued expectations may seem like a sign of maturity and wisdom, but sometimes this is just a defensive reaction. After repeated disappointments, betrayals, and neglect, hope becomes a vulnerable spot. To avoid repeated emotional wounds, a person subconsciously begins to defend themselves. They lower expectations, suppress desires, and prepare for the worst. However, behind this strategy lies unlived pain that requires healing. This way of life, although it seems safe, imposes serious limitations. By limiting your expectations to avoid pain, you simultaneously limit your openness to life. Relationships become superficial, and plans lose their scale and ambition. Enthusiasm is replaced by caution, and joy is overshadowed by the fear of loss. Carl Jung once remarked that the human soul strives for expansion, for constant growth and knowledge of the world. This thirst manifests itself in the desire for creativity, love, and new experiences. However, when the psyche receives deep wounds, it retreats into the shadows like a frightened beast. It is not that the desire to live a full life has faded, but rather the fear of new pain, the uncertainty that there will be enough strength to rise after another blow. Lowering expectations becomes a protective mechanism for those who have faced disappointment too often. This is not a sign of weakness, but rather an instinct for self-preservation, a way to emotionally shield oneself from a potential threat. But when this mechanism takes root, life loses its fullness and brightness. Fear becomes a filter through which all opportunities are sifted, and any manifestation of unpredictability is perceived as a danger. The first step towards breaking free from this vicious circle is awareness of one's behavior. It is not about returning to former, perhaps naive expectations. It is important to gradually, step by step, allow hope to once again take its place in the heart, without demanding immediate guarantees from it. You need to learn to desire without losing yourself in case of failure, to open your heart without exposing it completely, but also without avoiding it altogether. Returning to hope is not an act of naivety, but an act of courage. It is the bravery to acknowledge that, despite all the hardships experienced, the desire to live a genuine life has not faded. It is an acknowledgement that within each of us, even the deeply wounded, there still lives a part that yearns to feel, to dream, and to engage with the world. It is in this cautious openness that the soul regains its capacity for expansion, and with it, life itself. Not all emotional pain subsides with the conclusion of a specific event. There are profound experiences that continue to echo in the depths of human nature, even decades later. This isn't about deliberately cultivating suffering, but about certain aspects of what happened not being fully understood, felt, and released. In such situations, the past ceases to be merely a memory, becoming a tangible presence, a kind of shadow that constantly follows the person. Living with this burden, as if with unhealed wounds hidden from view, means carrying a heavy load, the true weight of which can only be understood by those who are forced to bear it. As the eminent psychologist Carl Jung noted, what you resist persists. And there is hardly anything that provokes such fierce resistance as emotional sorrow. This refers not to grief caused by physical loss, but to that which arises from unrealized opportunities, unfulfilled hopes, and unembodied dreams. It speaks of love that did not stand the test of time, of feelings that did not find reciprocity, of childhood that is irretrievably gone, of words that were never uttered, of what could have happened but never did. These invisible shackles of grief hold a person captive to the past, which continues to exert a defining influence on them. Often the ego tries to move forward without looking back, developing strategies of denial, minimization, and rationalization. However, the soul does not share this haste. It needs time to pause, understand what is happening, and accept the truth. Emotional sorrow requires space for the expression of feelings without judgment, explanations, or pressure to overcome it quickly. Letting go of the past does not mean forgetting it. It means integrating the experience, looking at past events and acknowledging this happened it affected me, it hurt me. And now a person can allow these memories to take their place in their inner world, but no longer as a bleeding wound, but as a conscious and accepted past. This is not erasing memory, but transforming a scar, something that no longer causes sharp pain, but continues to tell a story about what was experienced. Overcoming emotional trauma is a complex and often agonizing process because it forces a person to confront reality, discarding the illusions of well-being that the ego creates. The soul meets face-to-face with the loss that has long been hidden beneath a mask of denial. Only when this sorrow finds its expression does the past lose its power over the present. Habitual patterns of behavior cease to repeat, and old wounds no longer affect new experiences. Fighting the past is, in essence, remaining in its power. In contrast, allowing the past to recede is an expression of quiet but profound courage. It is an acknowledgement: I accept what happened, but I refuse to live based on this pain. In this act of acceptance, a certain dissolution occurs. The past does not disappear without a trace, but takes its rightful place where it can exist without dominating the present. When sorrow is experienced, the opportunity to live in the present opens up, and the future ceases to be merely a reflection of past suffering, becoming a space for creation. Behind every protective reaction lies a story, and behind every story lies an attempt to survive. The behavior of people who have experienced severe trials is not random or mistaken. Rather, they are unique survival maps, strategies developed in chaos, quiet mechanisms that the psyche invented to cope with the unbearable. Carl Jung deeply understood this, realizing that pain does not distort us without reason, but transforms us to ensure survival. What seems like coldness may simply be restraint. What sounds like distrust may be a defensive reaction. Pride, distance, or excessive rationality often mask fear, learned early in life and so deeply ingrained that it has become part of the personality structure. On the path to recovery, the starting point is not condemnation, but attentive listening, not alienation, but compassionate presence. Individuation, this profound Jungian process of self-discovery and becoming a person, unfolds not by bypassing emotional pain, but directly through experiencing it. It is in the courageous confrontation with the most painful aspects of oneself that one discovers areas that require transformation and renewal. When the ray of consciousness penetrates the hidden corners of the psyche, illuminating repressed, forgotten, or concealed parts, the painstaking work of rethinking and rewriting the internal history begins. Pain, brought out from the shadows of the unconscious, ceases to be an unbearable burden, turning into a point of contact with one's own deep essence. The mental wound does not disappear without a trace, but undergoes a metamorphosis, changing its position in the psychic structure. No longer the center of the universe, it becomes just a part of it. In this complex mental reorganization, one acquires something that no theoretical calculations can teach: a genuine presence in one's own experience. Healing is a non-linear and not a fast process, but quite achievable. It starts with the willingness to look behind the facade of behavior, both one's own and that of others. When the understanding comes that every person, like yourself, is simply trying to survive and adapt, using the resources available to them, true empathy is born, and with it, the opportunity to become more humane, whole, and free. Acknowledged and accepted pain ceases to be a defining force. Instead, it reveals the true essence. And perhaps this is the most significant turning point, the realization that suffering is not a dead end, but serves as a gateway, an invitation to return to one's true self, an invitation to start living for real. Not in spite of the traumas experienced, but thanks to the courage and awareness with which one faces their